Staying media literate through reading theory and keeping up to date with the latest trends and research is something I feel everyone should be partaking in. Media is so pervasive now that many thinkers believe Guattari's premonition of a post-media world has come into being, that a study of media will just become a study of people. Literacy has become a pressing concern in an age of fake news, a polarized news climate where traditional institutions having to compete with the choice to click off and take your attention elsewhere means they have deliberately raised the temperature on headlines and sensationalism. Knowing to look out for yellow or gonzo journalism is just a speck in a sea of issues and dynamics where your senses are used against you. Understanding film theory, for instance, even something as simple as Kuleshov framing, can help one look out for how they may be guided towards a preferred reading of text, documentaries that posture as impartial when they're anything but. Nonetheless, news and your media stream may set an agenda regardless of how you decode their messages. Both left and right are talking about the same things, even if they don't take the same stance. In both cases, the media spectacle maintains being fueled. There are those who remedy this postmodern condition by opting out. There's a cohort out there, many as young as Gen Z and Alpha, who are advocating for losing the social media accounts altogether. They cite the studies of Jean Twenge and Jonathan Haidt, where it's proven fairly conclusively that increased cell phone use is comorbid with the steep decline in mental health today. They are right to, but that seems not to be a viable solution for a lot of people whose work and livelihood relies upon their maintenance of their social media persona, or their actual persona for the post-media thinker. I myself make art for a living and my audience is a global one online that I can't just simply dislodge from. There also seems to be issues relating to a growing global interconnectedness that are baked into the collective psyche already, even if we all unplugged from here on out. Web 2.0 is the biggest of a myriad of postmodern cultural shifts that have led to a dissolving of old shared narratives and cultural homogeneity. Opinions are both more valuable and less valuable than ever. The belief once held by modernists in a fixed set of universal facts feels not just to be a fiction but a fantasy. Nietzsche's God is Dead playing out again, and perhaps in its most intense iteration. This seems to be implicitly understood by youth culture. In my experience, the youth are less comfortable with categorical claims because the explosion of multiplicitous viewpoints that they are raised on has conditioned them differently to previous generations, those who perhaps shared the same few news channels when they were more politically narrow. Using J-Reg's super academic and scientific scale of irony levels, many have said that meta-irony is the preferred humor style of the youth today, where nothing is being posited and the tone of the joke is where humor is derived from. If sincerity is seen at all, it is dressed up in humor and made palatable. Think to the Marvel quip. Meaning making still finds its way through somehow. There is also a new sincerity movement within literature and narrative art. So even in digital natives who have less grounding in the old world, they are driven to a return to it. The fear of the posit thus does not negate the need to posit, to function in the material world and live a fulfilling life of meaning. Opting out of meaning making does not negate the problem of what meaning there is to be made. Just like opting out of cell phone use merely kicks the can down the road unless you truly live off-grid and choose not to partake deeply in the lives of friends and family. What we have to do to make it work, and how we can find some kind of meta-universalizing principle in this interconnected space, is subject to intense discussion. Steven Pinker wrote in The Blank Slate that a tabula rasa clean slate does not exist, and that we have inherent desires that need addressing, shadow that demands integration, if we are to avoid its invisible hand striking us when we least expect it to. Of course, the post-classical activists, or post-structuralists, will not be satisfied until all cultural artifacts and power dynamics are inverted. They will argue that the conditions for tabula rasa don't exist, that there exists no place where a child may just grow up without questionable socialization. Regardless of which camp you fall under, the unitary self on an individual level is forced to remain somewhat rigid for everyday survival's sake. This was the main reason postmodern theories remained in high academia before the internet, according to Sherry Turkle, who wrote in Life on Screen that regardless of your conception of self as a society of mind, or believing that every aspect of language being nominally constructed, you still have to show up to work and refer to yourself as I rather than we, regardless of how shockingly different your D&D persona secretly is to your standard Starbucks cashier self. The internet gave the masses not just a bricolage or thinking device for postmodern concepts, but a landing zone for its concepts to be actualized more overtly and visually. The stability of our norms then becomes the underlying spiritual theme of the cultural milieu. In the culture wars, the right attempts to reinforce what once was, intellectualizing religion, harkening back to a time that arguably did not exist, the nation-state as depicted in Cold War-era commercials, whereas the left seeks to impose a new standard from the top down rather than integrating it organically, intellectualizing the margin, exceptions to the rules becoming the new rules, to predictably vitriolic reactions from all else. Even on the left, there's a nostalgia for the stable in spite of its instrumental deconstruction. The petulantly iconoclastic contemporary artist reverberates the desire for the sacred too, in their own new iconography. Matisse's last piece was literally a church, for instance. The Marxists are rediscovering and internally gesticulating all the time regarding the instrumental use of things like national identity or religion in mobilizing the proletariat, some away from the Marcusean repressive toleration model and towards the sacred idea of free speech yet again, in a second era of Trump where clearly the Marcusean hasn't worked. So it seems there are higher desires for things like love and belonging that cannot be socialized out of us overnight, and the Faustian movements will merely aggravate one's distress from incompletion. Twenge's narcissism epidemic signals a society hungry for food but lacking the means to cook, those who want to be loved but do not love, Tinder bios laden with demands but no offerings. The zombie religiosity is seen too in the recent Spotify Wrapped craze. It was noteworthy seeing such an abundance of activity signaling a craving for what is seemingly just a rundown of your music listening plus some fun facts situating your listening in the wider population. But perhaps that centering on the self is precisely what is significant here. It is the horoscopian need for an identity and construction of a stable looking glass self. The advent of a button that generates readings of the self to be shared for others to see, disappointment in results and hiding it from the public when it is deemed unhelpful to the social sphere, its echoing of the real world designated times for a Black Friday rush or clamor for Halloween to come sooner, reviews its shared psychological dynamic as an inversion holiday. Of course Halloween is prescribed originally as a liturgical means of remembering the dead, but now it's a chance for ego affirmation, to be looked at and receive desired social backchanneling for a choice of costume. Spotify Wrapped fulfills the same timely justification of identity actualization, its genesis from more genuine behavioral measurements, like those proposed by astrologists once, amplifies its legitimacy and attraction. This is real, supposedly, like IQ tests or Myers-Briggs claims to be as well. And like crack adult rats, they hammer the button, clawing for more in its absence, hoping for a different outcome next season if the reading fails to fulfill the bardic desire, in desperate pleas for advice from Gnostics and alterations to the reading as a simulacra of just behaving differently in the world, i.e. changing your listening habits in this case. Whereas horoscopes purport to some divine order of beings and Halloween to commemoration of the deceased, Spotify Wrapped begins from the top of the Maslow's without a copy of another. It projects onto the world from the desire for affirmation. It is Hegel's Entäußerung, but in a fast food format, a means of pornographic gratification for a fundamental desire such as those of love and belonging, with as shallow and withdrawn use of fetishized aesthetics as I've seen. With horoscopes, it's at least left in the abstract for the user to complete closure towards. With Halloween, you're the person behind the costumes, movements, and choosing. Here, it is entirely the ordering of references to the works of extra-textual musicians and artists, a form of micro-political cultural imperialism, harvesting not for collective nation-building, as with a museum of treasures, but for individual identity actualization, of public prayer but for a fractionated self as God, without a trace of an organic fingerprint, technocratically determined by software and hardware crafted by the big other. An analogy would be in the difference between gazing at a difficult work of abstract art, completing its meaning with your imagination, versus the ease of access from laugh tracks of junk food sitcoms. This represents a peak of the perceptual shift, tracing back to Edward Bernays and Anna Freud's psychological manipulation of the masses through the more top-down and vertical media landscape then, leading to Adam Curtis's notion of a century of self, a commodified and commercialized self. The population once resistant to convenience, say in an easy-bake consumer product, was tricked into its normalization through an egg being required for its completion, it being depicted as a product that demands your input, somehow, made it less taboo for subjects to use. We of course have no problem with convenience today. The population of women, once resistant to smoking, became charmed by its marketing as a means of female empowerment, as a sign of agency and mastery of a phallic object. Then you have the top-down masculine modernist model of thinking about technology, where once computer users desired to see under the hood, in the same way car users desired seeing exactly how a car worked to troubleshoot in a hands-on manner, knowing precisely what each part does in relation to the others. The Apple Macintosh signaled a trend towards a sealing off from such transparency, eventually making it so the machines can only be fixed by a staff of mystics, literally called geniuses. The iPhone and other devices curated at the store with distance, as though genuinely possessing magical qualities. Now, technology is said to foster a bottom-up and classically feminine approach of feeling your way to a desired result regardless of what the individual parts mean or whether you know how they work. This of course isn't an issue in itself, and there have been many great scientific advances and essays developed in this manner, but those great artifacts have been built on some appreciation, at least, of the tools handed down by top-down bravery and successes. Someone still had to arduously build the iMac for you to dance on the surface of it playfully. People of the past had to press ink on paper to create the newspapers you are now reading on a digital archive. Now, we have not only become dislodged from knowing what the bricolage represents, but we're treating the simulation as the real thing and forcing reality to follow suit. One shouldn't need a specifically ordained interface on an app to tell you what you listen to, insofar as you even need to know what you listen to if you have enough self-affirming habits generally. Everything the interface provides, you can attain on your own, at any other point of the calendar, but it is the nostalgia for the authoritative father that is alluring, of confirmation or feedback from anything beyond the self at all. When we don't understand the bricolage, we suck the big other into the self. We desire for the external to be morphed into something more easily controlled, like with the K-pop idols and testosterone-infused Hollywood stars to be cutesified, made cuddly and safe. Instead of mastering the environment, we make it come to us. Turkle refers to the changing meaning of the word transparency itself as a sign of this devouring trend. Once, transparency meant seeing everything under the hood, regardless of whether you understand it. Users just wanted to see it without disguise, just to know that it's there. Now, transparency means being able to understand something, even if it's been dumbed down and more important information has been hidden from you. Bad students describe the few academic essays that they can grasp as transparent, even when they're missing crucial information and what is to be understood is complex. The modernist prefers being given the complexity. They would rather complete the gap on their own accord, unlike the postmodernist. When all there is the dance, quite literally being left to one's own device, then we become slaves to our own desires without any agency or direction. Of course, Spotify Wrapped may just be a bit of harmless fun for some, but for many, it speaks to a dormant desire for an identity that many are not doing anything constructive to craft. The Lacanian subject desires to become an object through fortifying the object, becoming closer to the timeless sacred in the realm of the profane through handed down and graven imagery. The Lacanian subject acts as though other subjects are objects, particularly those celebrated by others, and thus having their beings reified as seemingly more legitimate, more concrete, more like real people. Thus, our own fame, or integration into the fame of a celebrity, makes us more concrete, so forth. It is a techno-personal extension without true affect, in the terms Kenneth Gergen puts it in The Saturated Self. Of course, postmodern scholars may say that things are only as real as what they're compared to. Disneyland is so phony that coming home from it makes your shopping malls feel real when even they are relative theme parks compared to what they pretend to be. However, it still stands within reason for most bound to the material world that some things are definitely more real than others, and when all you have is the fake, the art of others, rather than your own, you too will struggle living too fulfilling a life. The happier social media users, done up as they may be, are the ones with their own life to do up, not someone else's. Pervasively intensified as it is, the new is still a copy of the old. To not master the old and be mastered by the new means being governed by short grasping drives. Like an animal in a zoo, atrophying head to toe, not making their own art, music, or connecting to the world meaningfully. Lumps of meat labeled identity, fed to us on a silver platter, and we keep pressing the buttons in a timely manner, hoping to one day be fed.